Okay, so Texans are freaking out, and Anglo-Texans in North Texas, they're convinced that there's a slave insurrection going on. And so what happens is which is what often happened in Texas during this time, there's vigilante committees that are created, which are extra legal. Texas is still quite primitive. Society in Texas, especially on the frontier, it has really not taken root. It's still very much a pioneer community. There's not law and order in the way that, of course, there would be maybe even as soon as 20 years from 1860. And what happens is that slaves are rounded up. Some are tortured. They're questioned. It's like, okay, what do you know about this act of terror? What do you know about this slave insurrection? Dozens of slaves. We don't really know how many because people aren't really keeping records. But dozens of slaves are murdered. They're lynched during this period just to send a message to other slaves. The other thing is that Anglos, whites that had come into Texas from free areas, states where there wasn't slavery, especially missionaries, and there were Protestant missionaries, especially Methodist missionaries, that had come into this area. The gaze of these vigilante committees comes on these people as well, and they come under suspicion. They are also murdered. They're also lynched. Supposedly, the skull of one of these white ministers was over a saloon in Fort Worth for the entire Civil War, sending a message that any whites that would come into Texas and stir up a slave revolt, this is what would happen to them. It's a really extraordinarily brutal story. And even more so that, so the panic spread throughout Texas. And actually, what's interesting is that in South Carolina, when South Carolina leaves the Union after Lincoln's election, so this is about 6 months later, Lincoln's elected in November, right? And South Carolina leaves the Union about Christmas of 1860. The South Carolina, it's Declaration of Secession. All these folks, when they left the Union, they explained why they were leaving the Union, somewhat like the Declaration of Independence. They wanted to justify their behavior. Anyway, the South Carolina Declaration of Secession, explaining why South Carolina left the Union, talked about the Texas Troubles specifically, and said that this was an example of anti-slavery Northerners, whites, coming into Southern slave states and trying to start a slave rebellion. So people throughout the South actually paid attention to this incident. And what it does is it further radicalizes Southern whites. And of course, some of the folks that want Texas to leave the Union, if Lincoln is elected, they kind of fan the flames. They want to build the terror, the fright among whites during this period. And anyway, so people all over the South are paying attention to this incident. And the kicker is this, that when it was looked into a little bit more closely, it turned out that the reason that these fires had happened simultaneously, that had burned down parts of Dallas and Denton, was it had to do with the matches, the phosphorescent matches that merchants in North Texas, they bought it from a supplier, these matches, in New England. And if you know New England, the summers in New England do not compare to summers in Texas. That's why my wife and I and my kids, we go up to New England for 2 weeks every summer. It's heaven up there in the summer. It's horrible in the winter, but it's heaven in the summer. Anyway, so these matches that were purchased by all these merchants in North Texas, they just weren't built for the Texas heat. And because they were bought at the same time, that's why they went off at the same time. So it had nothing to do with a slave revolt. It had nothing to do with white abolitionists coming into Texas to stir up trouble. It just had to do with matches. So all this violence, all this murder, all this hanging, this vigilante action, the further radicalization of Southern whites. Now, whites would have left the Union without the Texas Troubles. They didn't need the Texas Troubles to leave the Union. They were freaked out enough, but it just pushes them just a little bit further. So really, that's the point of the Texas Troubles. It indicates the hysteria of Southern whites, slaveholding whites, or just Southern whites in general, on the eve of Lincoln's election. And I think it kind of helps explain why, after Lincoln is elected, that the South left the Union so quickly. Okay, Lincoln is elected in November, much to the horror of Southern whites. The demography of the United States in 1860 finally weighs in. And as I said in the previous podcast, the stark reality of a democracy in 1860 from the point of view of a Southern slaveholder was that there were more folks that lived in states without slavery than there were states with slavery. And Lincoln convinced a number. He didn't win any votes, probably literally no votes in the South. You could have gotten murdered, actually, if you had supported Lincoln publicly. And I'm not exaggerating. It would have gotten you killed in places like Houston and San Antonio, Austin and Dallas, anywhere in Texas. So, but he convinces enough Northern whites that his game plan is the best game plan, that he's not going to touch slavery where it exists. No one really wants a war. No whites want a war. I think African Americans are totally okay with a war, but no whites want a war. Very few anyway. And then he's going to kill slavery over time by containing it, but above all, he's not going to let slavery expand, which is what most Northern whites wanted. They didn't want slavery to expand, as I've said before, largely for economic reasons, not for moral reasons, which it really drives me crazy. I was up on the East Coast for 20 years that people in the North, they can be so arrogant about the South, where the North is deeply complicit in the slave trade. I mean, where was the cotton getting produced? It was getting produced in the states of the North. And very, very few Northern whites cared about slavery. So, you know, there's a lot of blood on the hands of Northerners as well during this period. It's not all Southerners. It's really a national shame, slavery. It's not regional, not just regional, I should say. Okay, so Lincoln's elected, and very, very quickly, the lower tier of Southern states decides that it has to leave the Union. And I'll show this map when I see you on Tuesday. But the first states that leave the Union are the states that have either the highest number of slaves or the highest proportion of slave to white. And this is a tier of states that stretches from South Carolina all the way to Texas. So what happens is in the first couple of months even before Lincoln is inaugurated, because remember, he's not inaugurated president until March of 1861. It was a little bit later than it is these days. These days it's January 20th that the president-elect is inaugurated. Even before Lincoln officially becomes president in March of 1861, the states in the southern part of the southern tier of slave states, from South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, they have left the Union. They leave the Union. They don't even wait for Lincoln to. Become president. Now, this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to end the podcast. But for the quiz on Tuesday, I want you to look at everything. You're going to be quizzed on everything, but in particular, and I'm going to try to get a discussion going on this as well in class. Part of the reading is the Texas Declaration of Secession. Texas is explaining why it feels like it needs to leave the Union. And here's the simple question I'm going to ask. Is slavery significant? Is it a significant factor? When I say slavery, I'm talking about the fear of emancipation, that slaves are going to be set free. So that's what I mean specifically when I'm talking about slavery. Is the fear of emancipation a central factor driving Texas out of the Union, the decision of Texas to leave the Union in early 1861. How important is the fear of emancipation, that slaves are going to be freed? Is it important? Is it an important variable, or is it a variable that has been exaggerated over time? So last thing I'll leave you with, when you look at the Texas, look at everything because you'll be tested on it. But when you look at that document, how important is it? How important is the fear of emancipation in the decision of white Texans to leave the Union in January, February of 1861?